Winnie-the-Pooh is the gentlest property in children's literature, a soft yellow bear of very little brain, living in a forest where the worst thing that ever happens is running out of honey. The stories are bedtime stories. They are designed to lower a child's heart rate, not to raise it. But they were written by a man who came home from the First World War unable to sleep, by a father who could barely speak to the son who inspired them, about a patch of forest that was a real place a wounded mind retreated into because the adult world had become unbearable. That last part is not a clever reading imposed from outside. It is biography. AA. Milne was a frontline officer at the Battle of the Somme. He wrote the Pooh books in the decade after the war, yet he spent the rest of his life insisting they had nothing whatsoever to do with it. The gap between those two facts, the war he survived and the war he erased from the work, is the subject here. Because the gentleness of Winnie-the-Pooh is not the absence of darkness. Rather, it is the most carefully constructed defence against darkness in the entire English children's canon. To understand what Milne made, you first have to understand what he was making it against. Alan Alexander Milne was already a successful writer well before 1914. He was an assistant editor at Punch, the most prestigious humour magazine in Britain, turning out light verse and clever sketches for a comfortable, witty readership. He was a pacifist by temperament and by stated conviction, and in 1915, at the age of 33, he enlisted anyway. He was commissioned into the Royal Warwickshire Regiment and sent across the Channel to France. In 1916, he served as a signals officer at the Somme, the battle that killed roughly 20,000 British soldiers on its first morning alone, the single bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. Milne's specific job matters more than it first appears. As a signals officer, his work was communication itself, laying telephone wire across no man's land, maintaining the fragile lines that carried orders forward and casualty reports back. It was a role defined entirely by the desperate attempt to keep meaning moving across a landscape engineered to destroy it. Most men at the Somme fought the enemy directly. Milne instead fought the silence, the constant breaking of the wires, the messages that never arrived, the words swallowed whole by mud and shell fire. He contracted trench fever and was invalided home in late 1916, which very likely saved his life. He then spent the remainder of the war writing propaganda for the Secret Intelligence Section MI7B, producing the cheerful patriotic copy he privately loathed. He later described that work with open disgust at what he had been required to manufacture on demand. What Milne carried home is documented in his own hand, and this is where the argument earns its footing, because the evidence is not inferred, it is written down and signed. In his 1934 anti-war book, Peace with Honour, Milne wrote with total clarity about what the experience had done to him. He called war a degradation and an insanity in those words. He wrote that the memory of it physically sickened him, that he could not so much as think about the war without a feeling of nausea rising in his body. This was not a man who had quietly processed his experience and moved on with his life. Rather, this was a man for whom the war remained an open and unhealing wound a full 18 years later, and who had decided that the only honourable response left to him was to argue, in public and at considerable length, that the entire thing had been madness from the start. And yet, in 1926, squarely between the trauma of the Somme and the polemic of Peace with Honour, he published a small book about a bear. There is direct testimony from Milne himself about why, or rather about why not. Asked repeatedly across the rest of his life about the meaning of the Pooh stories, he was remarkably consistent, and almost irritable in denying that they held any depth at all. He insisted that he was simply writing for children, that the books were nothing more and nothing less than exactly what they appeared to be on their surface. He spent an enormous amount of energy insisting the work meant nothing beyond the literal words on the page. But that insistence is itself the strongest piece of evidence we have. A man does not work that hard for that many years to deny a meaning that was never there to begin with. Before we can understand what was removed, we first have to establish the scene as it was left. And the scene is the 100 Acre Wood itself, which is not an invention so much as a transcription. The wood is Ashdown Forest in Sussex, where Milne bought a country home in 1925, the year before the first book. The geography of the stories maps onto the real geography of the forest with remarkable precision. The bridge, where the game of Pooh Sticks is played, is an actual bridge that still stands and still draws visitors. The sandy pit, the gloomy place, the enchanted spot at the very top of the forest, these are all real locations, walked and measured and renamed. Milne did not build a fantasy world out of nothing at all. Instead, he took an existing patch of ordinary English countryside and sealed it off from everything around it. The defining feature of the 100 Acre Wood is therefore not what it contains. It is precisely what it has been built to exclude. There are no adults in the 100 Acre Wood. There is Christopher Robin, a small boy, and there are the animals, and there is no one else in the entire world of the books. There is no work, no money, no illness that does not resolve itself by tea time, no death, and above all, no history. Nothing that happens inside the wood is ever caused by anything that exists outside the wood. Time itself barely moves. The seasons turn, yet no one ages, no one is born, and no one leaves until the very last page of all. It is a closed system, hermetically sealed against the entire category of experience that had nearly destroyed its author a decade earlier. The wood is not a place where nothing bad happens to occur by accident. Rather, it is a place engineered so deliberately that nothing bad is permitted to happen by design. The exclusion is not an oversight or a softness. The exclusion is the architecture itself. Read against the biography, the inhabitants of that sealed wood become legible in a way the gentle surface works hard to keep hidden. For decades, attentive readers have noticed that each animal seems to embody one distinct psychological state. And in the year 2000, a Canadian medical journal published a now famous semi-serious paper mapping each character onto a specific clinical diagnosis. The paper was a joke, but it was a joke with a real and unsettling observation underneath it. Eeyore's flattened affect and chronic hopelessness read cleanly as depression. Piglet's trembling, his catastrophizing, his constant rehearsal of disaster before it arrives, read as generalized anxiety. Tigger's recklessness and his total inability to sit still, Rabbit's obsessive need for order and control, Owl's grandiose and self-important confusion. Each one is a recognizable mode of a mind operating under sustained strain. But the clinical reading, taken on its own, is the shallow version of the insight. It treats the characters merely as symptoms to be catalogued and filed away. The deeper observation is what unites them, rather than what separates them into tidy diagnoses. These are not a random scatter of unrelated disorders. They are, quite specifically, the psychological aftermath of trauma, distributed carefully across a whole cast so that no single figure is forced to carry the entire weight of it alone. Hypervigilance and a constant, baseline sense of threat, that is Piglet, flinching at the wind in the trees. Emotional numbness and the fixed conviction that nothing will ever improve, That is Eeyore, half collapsed in his boggy corner. The manic flight into ceaseless activity that survivors use to outrun their own stillness. That is Tigger, bouncing because stopping is intolerable. Rabbit's rigid routines are not merely comic. They are the survivor's attempt to impose order on a world that has already proven, beyond any argument, that it has none to offer. The 100 Acre Wood is not a charming collection of cute animals. Instead, it is a single shell-shocked consciousness, broken gently into pieces small enough for a child to pick up and hold one at a time. And at the centre of all of it sits Pooh, the bear of no anxiety, no ambition, and no memory longer than the short distance to his next meal. Pooh is the only one of them who is genuinely and durably at peace. And his peace is built entirely upon his inability to hold a single complicated thought for long. He lives wholly inside the present moment, because the present is the only place that is reliably safe. The past contains loss and the future contains threat, but the present, blessedly, contains honey. This is not stupidity, though Milne affectionately and repeatedly calls it that. It is instead the precise psychological state that a traumatized mind dreams, helplessly, of returning to, a consciousness so simple and so smooth that it cannot be wounded, because it can neither truly remember nor genuinely anticipate. Pooh is not a fool. Pooh is the one thing Milne himself could not manage to be, and that is exactly, painfully, why Milne loved him. Now place the two versions side by side, because the comparison is where the real work gets done. The popular Winnie-the-Pooh is a story about friendship, gentleness, and the small, simple pleasures of an unhurried childhood. That version is entirely true, and it is the reason the books have comforted a full 100 years of readers all over the world. But it is true in the way that the calm, flat surface of very deep water is true. The gentleness is real, yet it is not the natural resting state of the underlying material. Rather, it is a product, manufactured at considerable personal cost by one specific man, for one specific and urgent reason. The conventional reading sees a kind writer simply giving children a peaceful little world to play in. The biographical reading instead reveals a wounded writer building, for himself first and most of all, the only peaceful world he could still bring himself to believe in, and then graciously letting children come in and visit it. What each version hides turns out to be the precise inverse of what the other one reveals. The popular reading hides the labour, the war, and the wound entirely. It presents the peace as though it had grown naturally up out of the English soil, as though a gentle man had simply written gentle things because gentleness was all he contained. The biographical reading, by contrast, hides nothing whatsoever about the wound, but in doing so, it risks losing sight of the genuine achievement, the fact that Milne actually succeeded at the task. That the comfort the books deliver is not a lie or a mask, but a real and remarkably durable thing he constructed directly out of his own damage. The honey is genuinely sweet, even though the bear who eats it was deliberately built to forget. One reading cannot see the wound at all, the other can barely see anything past it. The honest truth requires holding both readings in the hand at once, without letting either one win. And there is one further removal, the cruelest of them all, and the single one that neither reading is able to fully soften. The piece that Milne built so successfully for the whole world, he could not manage to build for his own son. Christopher Robin Milne was the boy in the books, named outright on the page, his real childhood toys made famous across continents. His private boyhood packaged and sold to the reading public long before he was old enough to consent to any part of it. He grew up to resent it deeply and permanently. In his own memoir, written much later in adulthood, He set the matter down with painful precision. His father had reached back into his own lost childhood and, in the very act of recovering it on the page, had effectively stolen his sons away from him. The warm and easy father-son intimacy implied all throughout the stories was, in the end, largely a fiction. The real relationship between the two men was distant, and it grew steadily more distant with the years rather than less. Milne, who could so vividly imagine a perfect closeness on paper, could not perform that same closeness inside the walls of his own house. He gave the gentleness freely to the books and to the children of total strangers, while the actual living child it had all been modelled upon stood outside the wood, looking in at it through the trees. This, finally, is the cultural argument, and it is a specific claim rather than a vague gesture. The standard account of Winnie-the-Pooh treats the whole thing as escapism, a retreat from a hard world into a soft one. But that framing is not quite right, and the imprecision in it genuinely matters. The 100 Acre Wood is not an escape from trauma. Instead, it is a structure for managing a trauma that cannot be escaped. Built carefully by a generation that had been handed no other tools to manage it with. Milne belonged to the exact cohort of men who came home from the First World War into a national culture that possessed almost no language at all for what had happened inside them. There was no real diagnosis worth the name, no therapy on offer, and no social permission to speak the thing aloud. The official response to what was then called shell shock ranged from bafflement to open contempt. Some men were court-martialed, and worse for displaying the very symptoms we would now treat with care. So an entire generation of survivors did, in their own private ways, exactly what Milne did publicly and at scale. They sealed the unbearable thing inside a structure too gentle to ever be questioned, and then they insisted, whenever anyone asked, that it meant nothing at all. That is what makes Milne's lifelong denial so important to read correctly, rather than dismissing it. When Milne said, over and over again across the decades, that the books were only books, that there was no depth to them, no hidden war, no buried grief anywhere in the pages, he was not concealing the meaning out of simple modesty or privacy. He was, in fact, performing the very same act that the books themselves perform on every page. The denial and the work are the same single gesture, merely scaled up to the size of a public life. The 100 Acre Wood quietly insists that nothing bad can ever happen here. Milne loudly insists that nothing serious is happening in these pages. Both of those statements are protective fictions, and both of them, without exception, are necessary for the whole structure to keep standing upright at all. Winnie-the-Pooh is what trauma actually looks like when a whole culture has agreed, firmly and in advance, never once to name it out loud. The denial is not a flaw in the work that we have now cleverly managed to see through. The denial is the load-bearing wall holding the entire thing up. So the comfort that the books give is genuine, and the wound that they were so carefully built over is also genuine, and these two facts do not cancel one another out in the slightest. Instead, they depend on each other completely and permanently. The 100 Acre Wood soothes precisely and only because someone needed soothing so very badly that he constructed it without permitting a single visible crack to show anywhere in its walls. A lesser, smaller need would have produced a lesser, leakier paradise. It is the sheer totality of the exclusion. No death, no money, no time, no aging, no war, no real ending. That gives the wood its strange and uncanny smoothness, and that smoothness is itself the unmistakable fingerprint of just how much had to be deliberately kept out. We do not feel the war anywhere in Pooh. What we feel instead is its perfect, deliberate, total absence. the way a quiet room feels subtly different when one specific person has only just walked out of it. One reading gives us a bear who has never once in his life had a single worry, sitting peacefully in the warm sun, waiting with infinite patience for honey. The other reading gives us a man who could not for one moment stop worrying, who was physically sickened by his own memory, and who built that bear precisely as the one thing he envied most in all the world. Both of these are entirely true at the very same instant, in the very same soft yellow shape, on the very same page a tired parent reads aloud at bedtime. It was never really, at the bottom of it all, a story about a bear of very little brain who happened to like honey. It was instead a story written by a man of far too much memory, about the single creature in the whole of that sealed forest he quietly envied above all the others, the one who was perfectly, enviably free, only because he had finally, mercifully, learned how to forget.